Hello and welcome to Tech Deals Part 6 of the $1,200 Ryzen 5 1600 computer build video series, Game Benchmark Time. Now in this video we're testing 13 different games, high detail 1080p on this build. Timestamps are down in the video description below. I do encourage you to watch at least the first few minutes of the first game that I'm going to show you because I talk about the CPU, the RAM, the graphics card in detail. Beyond that, if you want to skip around to the different games or maybe just the ones you most care about, or you just want to take a look at the frame rate charts, you can certainly do so using the links in the description below. I know this is a long video, however, it does go into more detail than your average benchmark does. This is part 6 in a long video series covering this computer in great detail. Part 1 is the parts overview. Part 2 is the Y vlog, a 1 hour 47-minute deep dive into every part and alternatives, including an $800 version and a $1,600 version of this build. Part 3 is the system build itself. Part 4 is system setup, BIOS update, driver install, Windows install, etc. Part 5 is non-gaming performance and a look at DDR4 2666 versus 3200. Doesn't make a difference. Here's the game video. The next and probably last video in this series, although we'll see what comes, will be the RGB beauty shots. I'm going to actually do some lighting on the case, put it on the desk, turn the lights down, and do something nice for you as the final video. Now we're going to get to the benchmarks, the live gameplay, and the charts in just a minute, but before we do that, I want to talk about CPUs and graphics cards as they relate to gaming for just a minute. Let's talk about CPUs first. As far as the Ryzen CPUs go, in terms of 2017 gaming for AAA games, Ghost Recon Wildlands, GTA 5, The Division, etc., the Ryzen 5 1400 is the best performance for the money spent. Most games in 2017 simply don't need more than 4 cores. It's nice to have. There are places where the games will use them, but you don't need them. You can absolutely play all the current games on a Ryzen 5 1400 4-core 8-thread chip without a problem. Why do I recommend the Ryzen 5 1600? Because I don't think most of you are building a new computer only for the next 18 months. You really want to get 3 years out of it before it's time to replace your CPU. Now, if you disagree with that statement, if you're only building a machine for the next 18 months, well, a Ryzen 5 1400 will in fact do that job just fine. But I think you're going to find when you get to and past Christmas of 2018, 4 cores is going to start to show its limitations. Now, there's nothing confirmed yet, but rumors are the next generation i5 chips, which are launching in the next couple of months from Intel, will be 6-core chips, not 4. The world is moving on from 4 cores being an enthusiast level processor. It will last you for a while yet to come. But if you want to buy something for 3 years, the extra $50 you're spending on the Ryzen 5 1600 just extends out when it's going to be time to replace that CPU. You're going to get more longevity out of it than you will out of a 4-core chip. That is even more true when you look at the Ryzen 3 processors. When Ryzen 3 launched just a few weeks ago, I made the comment at the time that it was an awesome value for the money, and it is. Ryzen 3 1200 for $109. It's $100 less than a CPU for casual machines, business machines, just browsing the web, playing League of Legends and World of Tanks. A Ryzen 3 1200 is all that you need. The problem is it's a 4-core, 4-thread chip. It's the same as the current generation i5s. There are games, Ghost Recon Wildlands is a good example, that are not smooth on an i5 or a Ryzen 3 chip. 4 threads is now very limiting for many AAA games. That wasn't true just a year ago, but it is true today. And if you're building a new machine today, you definitely do not want a 4-core, 4-thread chip if AAA games are what you want to do. From the perspective of a 3-year lifespan, the Ryzen 5 1600 is currently the best deal on the market today in terms of CPUs. Anything higher or anything lower than that, I think ultimately will cost you more money in the long run. But what about the Ryzen 7 1700? Is it worth considering? Yes, it is, if you extend your time horizon to 5 years. I do believe that if AAA gaming is something you are interested in and that's important to you, a Ryzen 7 1700 will get you more years of use than a 1600. 8 cores, 16 threads is not needed for AAA gaming today. That is for productivity, professional use at the moment. But I do believe over the next 3 to 5 years, we're going to grow into 8 core, 16 threads being enthusiast level gaming. And I think that even at 3.7 to 4 gigahertz on such a chip, you will grow into it over time. If you're the kind of person who wants to buy a machine and keep it 5 years, The $80 price difference it currently costs in August of 2017 to go from a 1600 to a 1700 is worth every penny in my opinion, but it's not as necessary. It is not as big of a jump today as coming from a 1400 to a 1600, which for $50 is worth every penny paid. Now, regarding Intel chips, any speculation about the 8th generation is just that, speculation. We don't have any official announcements, but it looks like we're going to have 6 cores, 12 threads on the upcoming i7-8700K. It will cost more than this, but it will perform better. If you're interested in high refresh rate gaming, if you like everything you see today, but 144 to 165 frames per second is important to you in AAA games, I suggest waiting for the i7-8700K. Not to worry, when it comes out, I will definitely test it. You will see benchmarks and comparisons against this on my channel. Moving on from CPUs, graphics cards. The GTX 1060 3GB card that's in this machine will play most current games 1080p, high detail preset, 60 plus frames per second without any issue whatsoever. Let me put a couple of qualifying statements there. On average, you will get 60 plus frames per second on average at high detail in most games in 2017. You will not have a minimum of 60 frames a second. There will be times and places in the games where the average drops below 60. There are places, for example, in The Witcher 3 that are more demanding than others where the performance will drop. So it's worth noting that on average, you'll get 60 frames a second, on average at high detail, but not minimums and not 100% of the time, and not in every game. Now, I realize that that statement might sound, well, kind of conditional, but it's meant to be conditional. For $220, that's a great value for the money. It's not what I would put in this build if I had a choice. Really, in a $1,200 build, I would put a GTX 1070. The problem is GTX 1070s are currently going for above retail due to the cryptocurrency mining situation going on in the summer of 2017. A few months ago, you could find those for under $350, and at those prices, I would get a 1070 all day long. They are 50% faster than that card, but they're not currently available, so it's beside the point. What would I upgrade to? The GTX 1080. This is an EVGA for the win GTX 1080. 1080s are available starting at about $500, and they are almost double the performance of that card. Not quite, about 90%, but as much as it doesn't make a difference, they're about double the performance. But it is more than twice the money. $220 to $500 is more than double the money, but not by that much. Double $220 is $440. So you're paying a $60 premium to get the extra performance needed to not have to upgrade your graphics card quite so quickly. Now let me be clear on this. While the 1060 is a great card today, it is already a year old. When you get to Christmas of 2018, that card is going to be 2.5 years old. It is not going to play AAA games launched in Christmas of 2018 at high detail at 60 frames per second. Not all of them anyway. There might be a few that do that, but it's going to age over the next 18 months, and you're going to be looking at a graphics upgrade sometime in the middle or the end of 2018 if you want to maintain high detail 60 frame per second gaming. The future progress always marches on. The detail levels keep going up. Games become more demanding. So that card is sort of an interim solution because the 1070s are not currently available. If you have the budget and you're okay to spend the money, a GTX 1080 will extend that to 3 years. I firmly believe this statement to be true. High detail, 1080p, 60 frames per second average, AAA games, 3 years. This $500 card should do that for you. Now, ideally, a GTX 1080 is a 1440p card. But of course, if you play at 1440p at high detail, this isn't going to last you 3 years. It's going to last you 18 months, maybe 24 months, and then it'll be time for an upgrade. But if you've got the money and you want to future-proof yourself a little bit, if you want to be able to maintain those high details and high frame rates a little bit longer, the extra $270, $280 this costs over a 3 gig 1060 is not a bad value for the money. Now, these are both NVIDIA cards. The AMD cards are very hard to find at the moment because of the aforementioned cryptocurrency situation. If you'd like to know what the comparable cards are, the RX 570 4GB card is roughly comparable in performance to the 3GB GTX 1060. You just can't find them for reasonable prices at the moment. The RX Vega 64 is roughly comparable to the GTX 1080. Now, the RX Vega 64 just launched a week ago, and the stated retail price is $499. If you can find an RX Vega 64 for $499, would I buy one? Sure. If you prefer AMD, if you have a FreeSync monitor, the RX Vega 64 is a fine choice at $499. Unfortunately, that's not what they're going for at the moment. But if you're watching this video in the future and you can find one for that price, then it's worth considering. But at the moment, they're currently over $650, and they're not worth buying at that price point. Most of my comments so far have related to 1080p gaming, which is where most people play games still today in 2017. But if you want to play games at 1440p, I would strongly recommend the $1,600 build that I showed in the Part 2 Y vlog. The main differences there were a jump to the GTX 1080 and the Ryzen 7 1700. If you want to play at 1440p, if you want to play AAA games at high detail or better at 60 plus frames per second, I do think a little bit more computer is required. Now, as I noted in that particular video, the RGB case, the RGB lighting, the RGB RAM are not required, and you can certainly delete those to save about $200 off that build. It takes it down to about $1,400, but somewhere in the $1,400 to $1,600 range is where I'd be spending for AAA 1440p gaming. Otherwise, you can get this build down, as I mentioned in that video, to $800 if you're willing to make some compromises and still keep that very nice video card and this very nice CPU. The test setup for the benchmarks you're about to see in just a minute, this processor was overclocked to 3.7 gigahertz fixed on all 6 cores, running on the stock cooler as I showed you in Part 4 system setup. We have 16 gigabytes of DDR4 2666 installed, not 3000, not 3200, important point. And we are using that MSI GTX 1060 that you see back there, but you do not have to buy that 1060. If you watched, I published back in February which 1060 you should buy, there's effectively no performance difference between any of the cards, 1 or 2 frames per second. It's very minor. The link down in the description below taking you to all the 1060s, buy the one you prefer based upon price, brand, size, etc. That's a very nice card, but you don't have to buy that one to get the performance you're about to see. Last note about the structure of the video you're about to watch. I'm first going to show you 5 performance results from the built-in benchmarks of 5 games. You're going to see a chart here in just a second. After that is going to be the live gameplay of 4 games. Then I'm going to show you the benchmark chart of that. After that, I'm going to show you 4 more games live gameplay, and then the final result after that. As I mentioned before, timestamps are down in the video description below. Please consider watching the first game of live gameplay, which is Ghost Recon Wildlands. I talk in detail there about the RAM, CPU, graphics card choices, how they're affecting the game in real time. The follow-up performance videos will be shorter for each game after that, but I put most of the detail there. Beyond that, you can certainly use the timestamps to skip around and see the parts that you're most interested in. Thank you and enjoy. The first thing I'm going to show you is 5 games tested using their built-in benchmarks. I'm not going to actually show you the video because it's the same every single time I do one of these videos. Instead, I'm simply going to show you the results. Now, the green bars are the average frame rate, the red bars are the minimum, and the blue bars are the maximum. There's no 1% lows here because these aren't long enough to bother including them, and the built-in benchmarks don't provide them. The first test is Mankind Divided, which averaged 60 frames per second, 50 at the minimum, 74 at the max. It's a fairly tight grouping. It's a pretty simple built-in test. Next up, we have Far Cry Primal, 80 frames per second average, 64 minimum, 92 max. Very good performance. Rise of the Tomb Raider, the average was excellent at 90 frames per second. Now the minimum and the maximum are very far apart, but that's typical of the built-in test of Rise of the Tomb Raider. 34 minimum is always on the second scene, it's always extremely low, this is pretty normal. The maximum there was on the first scene, and that's when you're basically looking at nothing but Lara Croft's head and a small piece of the rock, so it's just a momentary blip on both ends. Other than those 2 momentary blips, both high and low, it's fairly consistent and over 60 frames per second the vast majority of the time. Now that leads us to For Honor, a very beautiful game with detailed and rich settings, and look at this, 104 frames per second average, 85 frames per second on the minimum, 122 max. This performs really, really well. And then that brings us to Rainbow Six Siege. I kid you not, 143 frames per second average, 90 minimum, 202 maximum. This game really performs very well. It's beautiful, and it's kind of a bridge between the esports casual games and the AAA games, because this frame rate is closer to, say, an Overwatch than it is to a Ghost Recon Wildlands, even though it is a very nice looking title. Now, as I said, these are the game's built-in benchmarks, 1080p high detail preset in all of these. Now I'm going to show you some actual live gameplay and then show you the benchmark charts of those after the live gameplay. The first game I'm going to show you is Ghost Recon Wildlands, a beautiful 2017 open world game, absolutely gorgeous graphics, drive around, blow stuff up, drive into telephone poles. You want to do it, it's here for you. Yes, I know I did crash into that. That was not intentional. In the upper left-hand corner, you will see the real-time MSI Afterburner numbers. MSI Afterburner is a free program that you can use to see real-time performance on what your computer is doing. Now, I've done a video in the past on setting that up and how to do all of this, but I'll probably do another one because the procedure has changed slightly with the latest version of Windows. If you simply go to MSI's website and download it, the version of Rivia Tuner Statistics that comes with it no longer works with the latest version of Windows 10. You do have to download the latest 7.0 beta version in order to use the very latest version of Windows 10 with it, which is what we are running right here. Notice the nice shadow box placed around the numbers. It does make them a bit easier to read, so I am in fact running with the latest version there. Now, the labels that you see up there, and I've been asked this on previous videos, how do I make it say GTX 1060, 3 gigs of VRAM, etc.? These are custom labels that you can put into the MSI Afterburner program itself and actually put them up there. It's much nicer than having it simply say GPU, VRAM, etc. without actually any labels behind it. That is awfully brutal. Thankfully, my guys are very good shots because I mostly just crashed. Now, as I said at the beginning of this video, timestamps are in the description below. If you'd like to fast forward to the actual charts, if you get tired of looking at any one game, by all means, click the links down in the description below. They will auto fast forward you around this video to each of the different tests and to the benchmark charts if you simply want to see them. But I'm going to leave enough of this up here so you can actually see the game really being played. Driving around, you can see the CPU usage, the main system RAM usage, the real-time performance, the temperature of the graphics card, and so on. First up, I'd like to call your attention to the very first line, GTX 1060. The first percentage on that first line indicates the percentage of the compute power of the video card. In other words, how much of the actual raw function of the card is being used to draw what's on the screen. When you see it at 99%, basically it's being 100% utilized. Our limitation to further performance whenever it's at 99% is generally the compute performance of the graphics card. Now, the next number is going to be the temperature of the card, 64 degrees Celsius. This is extremely reasonable for an NVIDIA 10 series graphics card. Now, the fan is not turning very fast. It's less than 1,000 RPM. This is, after all, the MSI Gaming X. It is an oversized, large card with dual fans. They're temperature sensitive. They'll automatically turn as fast as necessary to keep the card cool while performing very well. You can see, of course, the actual RPM there, and then the clock speed at the end, 1936 megahertz. I did not manually overclock this card, very important point. The NVIDIA 10 series graphics cards auto overclock. This is even beyond the boost performance of the card out of the box. No 10 series card out of the box will come anywhere close to 1900 megahertz, but they will auto overclock themselves if they're running cool enough and they have enough available power delivery. Because this card comes with an 8-pin PCI Express power connector, there's absolutely no issue with power delivery, although frankly a 6-pin would be enough. And because of those large fans, there is no temperature issue, and so the card is running much faster. It is possible to overclock this further. This particular card will easily run in the mid 2 gigahertz range, 2050, even 2100 on some of these, depending upon your luck with your any given card. Some of my 10 series will run only at about 2000, some will run at about 2100. It just depends upon luck of the draw with your card. Now, the next line, the 3GB VRAM, is definitely worth paying attention to. We are running at high detail preset. Look at this shot. Look how beautiful that is. The rocks, the mountains, the road, the texture detail, the truck, the helicopter flying overhead, the power lines. This game is gorgeous. I absolutely love looking at this game. Notice that we're using about 2.5 gigabytes of VRAM. 3 gigabytes is plenty for high detail 1080p gaming. You do not need the 6 gigabyte version of this card. Now, this is a topic that's been talked about many times. I won't repeat this endlessly, but I did do a video October of last year, which should you buy, 3 gigabyte or 6 gigabyte? At the time, I absolutely solidly said buy the 3 gig card. Don't waste your money on the 6 gig. Now, many people have commented on that video and said, yeah, but what about future proofing? What about future games? Well, the thought that I'll leave you, and I don't want to repeat that whole video here, is if you turn Ghost Recon Wildlands up to ultra detail, does it need more than 3 gigabytes? Absolutely. It'll use 4 gigabytes at ultra detail at 1080p. However, it doesn't really matter because a GTX 1060 does not have the performance to play this game at ultra detail, so it's completely irrelevant. If you set this game to ultra detail on a 6 gigabyte 1060, you're going to be looking at lows in the teens. You're going to be looking at averages around 30 frames per second. It's playable-ish, but it's not very pretty. So while you need the extra VRAM for playing at higher detail settings, the 1060 doesn't have the compute performance to do it. You need a 1070 or 1080 to do it. In fact, in Ghost Recon Wildlands, if you want to average over 60 frames per second 1080p ultra detail, you need a 1080 Ti, a $700 graphics card to do it. Even the 1080 only averages about 55 to 57 frames per second at ultra detail at 1080p. I strongly recommend that the highest setting you put this game to is very high. Very high only drops performance 10 or 15% over high detail. Ultra destroys it. There's a few settings at ultra detail that absolutely bring performance right to its knees. It's beautiful for screenshots, and ultra detail, honestly, is great for selling high-end graphics cards, but the actual visual quality difference between high, very high, and ultra does not remotely reflect the complete performance difference you'll get when you actually crank the settings up to the max. When I play this game for fun, and I play it at high detail, better performance, higher minimums, and it still looks great. Now let me put a quick addendum in here. Everything I just said applies to the RX 580, assuming they ever come back in stock for normal price. The 4 gigabyte RX 580 is all that you need. You don't need the 8 gig card. So why did I recommend the 8 gig card when the RX 580 launched? And even 3 months ago, I made several comments saying go ahead and buy the 6 gigabyte 1060. The reason for that is when the RX 580 launched, there was only a $20 price difference between the 4 and the 8 gigabyte version of the RX 580. Likewise, 3 months ago, the 3 and 6 gigabyte 1060s were only $20 apart. And I made the comment at the time, well, okay, for $20, sure, get the higher VRAM card. That's a very minor price to pay just to not have to worry about it. On the day that I'm doing the voiceover for this video, there's a $60 price difference between the 3 and 6 gigabyte 1060s. And of course, the 580s aren't available at all at anything approaching normal prices. Would I pay $60 more for the 6 gigabyte card? Absolutely not. It is not remotely worth it. If you want more performance, you need to be on a 1070 or 1080. And in August of 2017, when I'm actually recording this video, the 1080s are actually a better deal than the 1070s due to the cryptocurrency situation. I don't want to get into that in too much detail, but at the moment, there's only about a $50 price difference for various reasons between a 1070 and a 1080. And the 1080 is about 25% faster than a 1070 and nearly double the performance of this card. So if you want more than the 3 gigabyte 1060 in August of 2017, buy an 8 gig 1080 for $500. I know it's a large price increase, but for just over double the money, you get about double the performance. It's actually a fair ask considering what it does for you. If you want to play games such as Ghost Recon Wildlands at 1440p at high detail, you'll need the 1080. The 1060 will do it, but not this well. You'll have to lower it to medium detail to get decent performance, and the visual quality really starts falling off quick. So for AAA gaming 1080p, buy the 1060. For AAA gaming at 1440p, buy the 1080. That's my current August 2017 recommendation. Okay, end of speech on VRAM. Let's move on to line 3, the Ryzen 5 5-1600 CPU. Now this is a 6-core, 12-thread processor, so it has 6 real cores and 6 virtual cores. Technically it's not hyper-threading since that's an Intel trademark term. They call it SMT, but it's the same thing basically. You will notice that we're using about 50% of our CPU. Now the way the percentage here works is 100% usage would be all 12 threads fully utilized. This game does not really use all of the extra threads, but it does, however, use all 6 real cores. Now just here, with a lot going on in the fighting, you could see it jump up to 70%. We were comfortably into the hyper-threading at that point. In fact, we're still there. There's 70%, 76%, 82% at the moment. But most of the time, you'll see this around 50% or so. If you have a 4-core, 4-thread chip, this game is actually not smooth at all. It will play, but it's not smooth. If you have a 4-core, 8-thread chip, such as an i7 from Intel or the Ryzen 5 1400, it is much better, but it's still not as good as this. I would take a Ryzen 5 1600 over an i7 7700K, even though that chip is faster per core and has a higher clock speed. And the reason is 6 cores, 12 threads at 3.7 gigahertz is much smoother in terms of overall gameplay than 4 cores, 8 threads, even at 5 gigahertz, which is what I run my i7 7700K at. Now, Coffee Lake is coming soon, the 8th gen. Now, there's been no official release. I have no inside information from Intel on that, but the rumors are all over the web that sometime in September or October, Intel is going to be launching the 8th generation of chips. Now, don't expect these to be as inexpensive as the Ryzen 5 1600 is, which is a $220 CPU. Rumors are we could be over $350 on the i7 8700K, but the 8700K is going to be the same as this in terms of 6 cores, 12 threads with a max out-of-the-box turbo speed of 4.7 gigahertz. So a full gigahertz faster than this chip and the same core count, the same thread count. So you should get higher refresh rate gaming on that processor, but at a higher price. Now, if that processor motherboard cooler combination ends up costing twice as much of this as this chip, it's simply going to be a question, do you want to play at 60 frames per second or do you want to play at 100 plus frames per second? But of course, you wouldn't pair a GTX 1060 with that, or you shouldn't anyway. The 1080 would be better paired with the new i7 8700K, whereas the GTX 1060 is a very nice pairing with the Ryzen 5 1600. Rest assured, when Coffee Lake comes out, I will test it. I will test it on both graphics cards, and I will put that up against the numbers you see here to let you know which one I think is worth the money and how much performance do you get for spending the extra cash on that higher end platform. Now, a quick note about processors in general. For a long time now, 10 years, 4-core processors have been the high-end consumer desktop. In late 2008, mid-2009, Intel came out with the first i7 chip, the 920, and that was 4 cores, 8 threads. It brought hyper-threading back from the Pentium days. Since that date, 4 cores, 8 threads has been the top-end chip from Intel. This is now clearly changing. Even the i5 is supposed to be a 6-core, 6-thread chip, and the i3s are finally going to be 4-core chips. It looks like 2-core chips are completely going away. If you are putting together a gaming machine and you are on a budget, the Ryzen 5 1400 can look very appealing at about $160, but that is a 4-core 8-thread chip, and while you can use it for the moment, it is going to age much more quickly, in my opinion, than a Ryzen 5 1600. If you are planning on playing AAA games such as Ghost Recon and future titles released over the next 3 years, I strongly encourage you to get the Ryzen 5 1600 over the 1400 or the 1500X. I think that those extra 2 real processing cores and the 4 extra threads will age much more gracefully over the next few years than the 1400 or 1500X will. Those are going to become the new minimum. Now, what about Ryzen 3? When Ryzen 3 launched, I made a comment on the launch video that said this is a great esports or casual gaming processor, but I would not recommend it for AAA games. Many people said, what are you talking about? 4 cores, 4 threads, it's just like Intel's i5s. Yes, it's like all the i5s from the past, but the i5s are going to become 6-core, 6-thread processors here very shortly. Game developers over the next 3 years are moving to this new platform, with 6 cores being the true minimum for AAA gaming. Now, not today, not tomorrow, but over the next 3 years. Now, if you upgrade your computer every single year, okay, sure, fine, it doesn't matter. But very few people do that. If you're planning on getting 3+ years out of your computer, the extra $50 that the Ryzen 5 1600 cost over the 1400 is $50 very well spent, and I recommend you put the money in this before anything else in your computer. RAM, storage, even graphics cards are all much easier to upgrade. Trying to replace your CPU in 18 months when you discover there's games in Christmas of 2018 that really need 6 cores, they may run on 4, but they'll be smoother and a better overall experience on 6. You can't just spend the $50 at the time to glue on the 2 extra cores. You really want to go ahead and get the best CPU that you can afford, and you can upgrade everything else over time if need be. Okay, end of speech on CPUs. Let's move on to main system RAM. Now, if you look at the main system RAM here usage, you'll see about 7.2, 7.3 gigabytes, and many people will see that and go, great, I only need 8 gigabytes of RAM. No, you really don't. You need 16 if these are the kind of games you want to play. Now, in 2017, if you're playing Overwatch, League of Legends, Dota 2, Counter-Strike Global Offensive, World of Tanks, World of Warships, even Rainbow Six Siege isn't that bad about it. 8 gigabytes of RAM is enough. If you're playing GTA 5, The Division, Prey, Mass Effect Andromeda, Ghost Recon Wildlands, etc., you need 16 gigs. It really does make a difference. Yes, you can get away with less. Windows will swap things around. Windows 10 will compress your RAM, but that does affect performance and smoothness, but it will do it and make it work. Even though this says that you're using less than 8 gigabytes of RAM, you're really not. I absolutely promise you, Windows right this second is using 100% of the available RAM. There is inactive code that is marked as unused. Microsoft started doing this a few years ago when people complained that Windows was a memory hog. So what they did in Task Manager and in memory allocation is they marked unused code, programs that weren't actively running, as available. But if you actually look in Task Manager, you'll see it's actually allocated, but not shown in the used main system RAM. So things that are running in the background, tasks, code, etc., they don't show up in the actual allocated RAM. However, they are still in there. So Windows is using more RAM than it says. And I went and talked straight through the transition over to The Witcher 3. We'll briefly talk about this. This is not a very long video right here. In fact, all the rest of these are going to be much shorter, which is what those timestamps are for. I gave the big speeches during Ghost Recon Wildlands. We are using 100% of our graphics card. You can see the 99% up there. We're using far less VRAM, however. We're using less than 1.2 gigabytes. The actual CPU usage here is quite low, but this is the beginning of the game. There are places in the game where you will use more, but since I haven't finished it, I don't have that. I have a saved file here that I've used over and over and over, and I'm just still using it because it allows you to compare the benchmark runs between my older gameplay and my newer gameplay. If I start doing it in new places in the game, then it invalidates the comparison to my older benchmark. So I'm keeping this. At some point, I'm just going to stop testing this game. If I had it to do over again, if I could rewind 6 months, I would have used a different save game file for all of my Witcher 3 benchmarks. But in order to keep all of the Witcher 3 gameplay runs comparable to each other, both today, 6 months ago, etc., I'm keeping the same game file. Now, I just gave that big speech about 16 gigs of RAM. You'll notice here that we're using less than 5. Okay, at this point in the game, just running along the beach, yeah, okay, fine. 8 gigabytes would probably be enough. It won't be for the whole game, but it would be here. Look at our real-time frame rate, which I didn't really have a chance to call out during the Ghost Recon Wildland video, but frankly, it was up there long enough you could certainly see it. Notice that we're over 60 frames a second. I would like to make this point absolutely clear. GTX 1060, 3 gigabytes of VRAM, 60 frames per second, high detail, pretty much in everything. Now, there's going to be a few exceptions here and there, but you're going to find that this is a great 1080p gaming card. Now, one thing that I really want to make clear is that that's true at this moment in time. Do you need a 1080 to play games at 1080p resolution today? No, absolutely not. Will you 3 years from now? Yes, absolutely you will. How soon do you want to upgrade your graphics card? How much detail do you want to have to turn down over the next 18 to 24 months? to keep using a 3GB GTX 1060. It's no different than if you'd bought a GTX 960 when it launched. The GTX 960, when it launched, was a great 1080p gaming card, but it has aged, and today, while it will do it, it's pretty rough. The performance difference between a 960 and a 1060 is pretty dramatic, and so if you wanted to play The Witcher 3 on a 960, you either need to lower the resolution down to 720p, you need to turn the detail down to medium or low, and perhaps still accept less than 60 frames per second. Now, those of you who have played more of The Witcher 3 will be the first ones to tell me, wait a minute, you're getting 60 frames per second here in this part of the game. Go into the city, go further into the game, and it will drop below that. You're completely correct. It will not maintain 60 frames per second all the time, but that's true across almost all of these games. Ghost Recon Wildlands was not above 60 frames per second all of the time. If you want 60 frames per second as a minimum at 1080p, you really do need a GTX 1080. The 1060 is to average 60, not be a minimum of 60. And even with a 1080, there are going to be times and places where you drop below 60 frames per second, but not nearly as much as the 1060 does. Moving on to our next game, PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds. This is the very first time I have benchmarked this game, and a quick shout out to Midnight Banshee for gifting this to me. Thank you very much, sir. Now, we have 93 players in this match, and this is the very first match that I ever played. So if I suck, my apologies, but it's not my specialty. Notice that I do not have fraps running in the upper right-hand corner. I'm not benchmarking this part. You'll see the actual yellow numbers in the upper right-hand corner go away when I press the F11 key to start benchmarking. This is an important point. It's only the actual combat on the ground that we want to test, not this flying part, which of course runs just fine. Now, I will say what's interesting is the VRAM usage of this game does in fact show 3 gigabytes. Because this is the first time I've tested this game, it may very well use over 3 gigabytes when you're actually on the ground running around, but the only way to test that is to put it on a 6 gigabyte card. But when you see the performance of this game, you'll have to ask yourself, does it really matter? Well, we're going to find out here, aren't we? I will say it's a nice looking game. This is a nice big wide open map. It looks like there's a lot of places to go. My goal here was to simply drop in an area where I thought most people wouldn't be. I wanted to survive long enough to get a decent average so that the results you see at the end with the 1% and 0.1% lows as well as the average was spread across a large enough time. My actual record ended up being 19 minutes long. No, I didn't win the game, I didn't even come close, but I finished better than 40 out of a field of 93, mostly because I'm chicken and I hit a lot. Now, I do have to put a big disclaimer on this particular test. All the other games that I'm showing you in this video, I have enough experience in to feel comfortable discussing their performance intelligently. I can talk about what they do and don't include, such as, for example, in The Witcher 3, about the fact that other areas of the game are more demanding. This is the first game I have played in this game, so I have nothing to compare it to. I have not run it on other cards. I have not tested it on other CPUs. I have no frame of reference as to how this performance relates to other cards. So that's the full disclosure with the big asterisk and disclaimer, but I'm including it because people want to see it. Now, I certainly could have gone, and I don't know if that's a good gun to find or not, but I thought it was kind of cool, actually. It looked like a fun gun. I've watched a few replays from other people. I've watched a couple of streams on Twitch about this, mostly from Renee, and that has given me enough information to at least get into it and realize, okay, run around to the buildings, pick things up, and there's an equip screen, and sort of beyond that, I really don't know what I'm doing. In future looks at this, I may go into more detail. I'll have to play it more to get a better feel of it. By all means, feel free to leave your comments down below. Suggestions, thoughts, what you want to see done differently. Do you want this game included? Do you not want it included? Do I suck at it? Yes, I know I suck at it. So, you don't have to tell me that, but you can if it makes you feel better. Looking up the real-time performance numbers, I noticed that we're still using about 3 gigabytes of RAM. We are probably VRAM limited here to be exactly at 3 gigabytes where it's at, in fact, probably once more than that. However, look at our frame rate. We're in the 80 frame per second range, so if we are VRAM limited, it doesn't seem to be making a big difference. CPU usage doesn't seem to be that high. At about 18 to 20%, we're not using more than 4 cores here, so an i5 would be running this just fine. Now, I'm not in a big battle, there's not a lot of enemies around, so that also may be affecting it. Again, disclaimer, first game, so I don't know how that affects it. Notice our main system RAM usage, 8.7, 8.8 gigabytes. That's probably higher because we're over the three. Well, the way the graphics card works, this is an important point. The way the graphics card works is when you need more than 3 gigabytes of VRAM, the game doesn't just crash, it overflows into main system RAM. It is possible that this game would actually be using less main system RAM if I had the 6 gigabyte 1060 installed. I might go back and actually do a PlayerUnknown Battleground comparison, 3 versus 6, just to see what the performance difference is, and then we can take a look at the main system RAM. Let's say, for example, this game wants 4 gigabytes of VRAM right now. We are running at high detail, remember, I'm using the preset. Then what would happen is the VRAM usage would be higher, but then the main system RAM usage would be lower. Now, as far as the frame rate goes, it's wonderful, but of course, without a reference or something to compare it to, it is what it is. But for everybody who says that this game plays poorly, it sure doesn't look like it to me. I have seen post after post from people saying, oh, PlayerUnknown Battleground, that's a horribly optimized game with terrible frame rates. It needs a ton of computer and it stutters and it's difficult. Now, maybe some of those comments come from people who have played it in earlier releases. This game is still in early access. It hasn't been officially released. Although, as far as I'm concerned, if you're charging money for it, it's released. Early access would be like free demos. I really don't like this system of selling games before they're finished. If you're charging for a product, then it should be ready to rock. I don't think you should be charging for pre-release stuff, but that's a conversation for another time. I'm just going to make a couple of cuts because I spent some more time running around this village looking through every nook and cranny, and that got boring, so I skipped ahead to this. I did find my inventory page. I tried putting something on. I looked at the rest of the items to see what I could equip. I'm sure that there's a lot more that I could do with this, but again, first game, it's a learning experience. Now, I spent some time here trying to see if I could scope out things. I didn't have a sniper scope. It would really be helpful to have binoculars or a scope of some type. Now, I realize that this game does not give you like little headers above everybody's names, or above everybody's characters, so you can easily identify where they're at. Here I am looking in the map trying to figure it out. It took me a second to realize I'm at the bottom, and as the map shrinks, I'm going to have to get up to that location, so it's time to get moving. But since you don't have any identifiers or indicators that are like, hey, here's the bad guys, shoot at them, you have to pick them out of the scenery. And that is just a sort of a combination of resolution, detail settings, and how good your eyes are. And I'm not very good at this at all. My biggest challenge to playing a game like this is you never see anyone. And if you see them, then you've taken them by surprise and hopefully you can kill them. And otherwise you don't see them and they kill you. So it's entirely possible that this has to be played in teams, or maybe you actually do want to turn the graphics detail down all the way so that you don't have the clutter of trees or grass getting in your visibility range. I haven't played with the detail settings. I put it on high detail, launched it, and ran with it. That being said, I'm never going to see a single enemy in this entire match, and I played for 19 minutes. But I never saw anybody, so go figure. If you get into a game like Overwatch, where the enemy is coming from, what the objective is, and what they look like is clear and obvious. Rarely do you die from somebody that you don't actually see coming. Occasionally with the snipers and stealth and a few other things, but generally you see the enemy coming. Yeah, I realized I had to come around to this side. What can I say? So I get in this vehicle, which is kind of cool, and I go for a drive, which hopefully demonstrates performance. We're still over 60 frames per second. For all the talk that this doesn't play well, it sure looks pretty good to me. You're going to be surprised when you look, in fact, at all of the game performance numbers at the end of this video. These games played very well. Once again, let me reinsert the disclaimer. Since I don't know this game and since I haven't played it other than this one time, this may or may not be representative of the game's real performance. It is possible that if you end up in a firefight with 4, 5, 6 other people, if you end up in an engagement with multiple vehicles, if you're in a different part of the map, then the performance might be less. If you are a regular player of this game, use your own knowledge of the game, looking where I'm driving and what I'm doing to interpret these results as to how well you think it'll run on this computer. Suggestions on how to better benchmark this? I am all ears. The challenge is, of course, because it is a battle royale style game and because you die and then you have to load a new match. If I rush to engage the enemy or drop in the middle of the map in the middle of a town, I might get killed very quickly. Then I end up in the position of having to launch another one because As a general rule, I really want to get at least 10 minutes, preferably 15 minutes in the Fraps run in order to get a good benchmark result. The 1% and 0.1% lows need a decent sample size to be useful. It's why I do not use them on the game's built-in benchmarks. When you run games built-in benchmarks that last 60 seconds, the 1% and 0.1% minimums don't mean much. The benchmark isn't long enough for 1% of the frames to be noticeably different from, say, just the standard minimum. But when you play for 10 minutes, a 1% minimum actually deviates from the minimum by enough to be worth the trouble. And I am getting shot here, but of course, I have no idea who's shooting at me. There's no direction indicator, there's no radar. I know it's what this game is, but what are you supposed to do? How do you see them? It's not my style of game. What can I say? I mean, in full fair disclosure, this is not a game that I'm ever going to be playing outside of benchmarking. It's just not my cup of tea. If you enjoy it, more power to you. But games where I'm just being shot by somebody that I can't see don't interest me. This is why I like playing D.Va in Overwatch. Give me a shield, give me a tank, give me short-range plasma cannons, and let me blast the enemy when they're standing right in front of me. This long-range sniping of people I can't see? Yeah, not my thing. I am going to leave just another minute of this in here, then we'll switch to the next game, simply because there are a couple of moments here where it does dip below 60 frames a second. You're going to see one here in just a minute. And there we are down to 56, 62, 56, 55. So we are touching below 60 frames a second in places here. Now, of course, if you have a GTX 1060 3GB card and high refresh rates or high frame rates is important, look at that. That drives really well over all this. If you're looking for higher performance, don't put it on high detail, put it on medium detail or play with anti-aliasing settings. Presets are useful to set the game to the same settings run after run, match after match across computers, but you don't have to be married to the preset. Go in and tinker around, remove settings and see what the effect on the performance is. Turn off anti-aliasing, turn off shadows. Shadows in a lot of games are one of the biggest detriments to performance. Turning off shadows can often give you a 10 to 20% performance boost just on that one setting. Moving on from PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds, we move to The Division. Now in The Division, we are playing in the Underground. This is the first downloadable content. Easy repeatable missions, generally between 10 to 15 minutes long each. Easy to benchmark since they're randomly generated maps, although they're pretty consistent from run to run. The overall assets, the design of the rooms is pretty similar from run to run. The enemy locations and the objectives do get randomized, but otherwise, the results of underground runs are much more consistent than the above ground stuff that I've done in earlier benchmarks. Now, unlike PlayerUnknown Battlegrounds, where I am inexperienced, I am very experienced in this game, having finished the main story, so I can talk to you more about the game's actual performance throughout. Now, player versus player in the Dark Zone is not going to perform as well as what you're watching right here. I don't play this in player versus player. I tried it once and it was not a good experience, so I don't do that. Now, the player versus environment above ground in the streets of New York is a little bit slower than this depending upon what area of the city you're in, but it's not too much slower. Overall, the player versus environment, the single player game, performs very, very well. But the player versus player, especially in busy firefights in the Dark Zone, will be a bit slower. So if that's what you're interested in, I would mentally take about 20 to 25% off of the performance numbers you're seeing here to get an idea of how well that will run. Taking a look at our real-time performance numbers, we are totally graphics card limited here. We're pegged at 99% on the graphics card. All the other numbers look good. VRAM usage is right at 2 gigabytes. So the 3 gigabytes is absolutely plenty. You would not gain anything from high detail at 1080p in The Division from anything more than 3 gigabytes. The CPU usage is below 50%, so we are not using all 6 cores. In fact, at the moment, we're using about 4 of the cores. So an i5 or an i7 would certainly run this just fine, or even a Ryzen 3 or Ryzen 5 1400 would run it just fine in this particular location. There are times, however, where The Division will scale beyond 4 cores, 4 threads. So if you want to play this game either competitively in player versus player, or you want to play it at higher frame rates, higher detail settings, higher resolutions, you'll want more CPU. But at least in the confined area of the Underground DLC, 4 cores is enough for the most part. The main system RAM usage is very similar here. We're less than 8 gigabytes of RAM, but again, as the comments that I made back during the Ghost Recon Wildland overview, you still should have 16 for this game, especially in the PvP areas, especially in the above ground sections, which actually in many cases use more RAM than this confined instanced area in the underground. I know I've repeated it before, I'm not going to go into it again, but let me just state that if you want to play these games, you really should have 16. It's not that expensive, and if you have a nice computer such as the one we're testing here, it should definitely be on your short list. I'm now going to jump ahead to the next battle with the enemies, since running from room to room doesn't basically show you anything. As you can see here, we're in the mid 70 frame rate. It does dip down during heavy combat, especially with fires and explosion and such, but at no point is this ever not controllable. It really is very easy to play. So if you want to play this game at 1080p, a GTX 1060 3GB card is all you need. If you want to play at 1440p, a 1070 would be plenty, although at the moment they're too expensive, so get a 1080 and be good for several years to come. In just a second, I'm going to bring up the benchmark chart for the 4 games that I have just shown you. After that benchmark chart, I will do 4 more live gameplays and I'll show you a chart of those, and we'll talk about those at that point. So here we are at the benchmark chart of the past 4 games that I just showed you. The green bar is the average frame rate, the red bar is 1% minimum, and the blue bar is 0.1% minimum. Let me be clear about something here. 1% minimum is not the actual true minimum. It's the bottom 1% of the frames taken out to show you the minimum frame rate you'll get 99% of the time. I consider the red bars to be the playable frame rate. That's the lowest it's going to drop in a noticeable way. The blue bar takes it 1 decimal place further to 0.1% minimum and is much closer to the true minimum. Notice PlayerUnknown Battlegrounds had a 1% minimum of 47 and a 0.1% minimum of 26. There must have been 1 frame in there, a jump, a place going into a building, or maybe when I died, where it actually kicked down to 26. But I challenge you to watch all the gameplay footage I put in there and find anything that low. This is why I think the red bars and the green bars are the ones you should focus on, because that shows you real playability. Ghost Recon Wildlands, 64 frames per second average. Yes, it dipped below 60 at times, but not by much. The Witcher 3, also 65 frames per second, extremely playable. PlayerUnknown Battlegrounds is really the one that surprised me. I have seen report after report of everybody saying that that game was horribly optimized, that it needed tons of computer, tons of graphics card, and didn't play well. Now, as I said before, full disclaimer, this is my first match. It's in that one area of the map. Other runs, other situations may be different, but 74 frames per second average, that's extremely playable. It was over 60 frames per second the vast majority of the time. Now, we do have a 1% minimum of 47, but I sure didn't see it. There must have been a handful of lower frames that just kind of crept in there. It does keep track of every single frame, and so if there's 1% of the frames that are down at that level, it's going to put them in there. But it was over 60 frames per second the majority of the time. The Division, just as you just saw, perfectly completely playable. A few places where there was fire and explosions and things where it had a momentary dip in performance. But so far, every single game that I've shown you here, the first 5 with the built-in benchmarks and these 4 here, are 60 frames per second or better in average. We have minimums and 1% minimums that are generally in the 40s to 50s. If you want the minimums to be closer to 60 or over 60, simple, get a GTX 1080 and you will have better minimum frame rates with averages closer to 100 to 120 frames per second. But of course it costs more. You're going to spend about $500 for a 1080 versus $220 for a 3GB 1060. Now, the RX 570s and 580s are currently out of stock at normal prices everywhere, but if you're watching this in the future, please note that a 4GB RX 570 is very similar into performance to everything you're seeing here. It's almost interchangeable. The RX 580 is similar to the GTX 1060 6GB card. It's about 10 to 15% faster than this, but what you're looking at here, give or take a few frames, is almost identical to an RX 570. Next up, we have Mass Effect Andromeda multiplayer. Now, what's interesting about this is multiplayer actually performs better than single player. So why am I including multiplayer? Well, my thinking is that this far post-launch, if you really cared about this game, you've already played it. If you don't, then you might skip it at this point, because honestly, it's probably the weakest title in the series. But if you like the multiplayer, then you can keep playing that for some time to come. EA recently announced that they have ended all single-player development on this game, so there's not going to be any story downloadable content. Nothing new is coming for Mass Effect Andromeda. Frankly, the single-player story was not very well received. However, they are going to continue developing the multiplayer game. There will be additional content out for multiplayer, which is why I am testing it. As you can see here from the real-time numbers, we are maxed out on our graphics card, sometimes over 100 frames per second. We're using about 2.5 gigabytes of VRAM, so our 3 gigs is just fine. CPU usage, we're right at about 4 cores, a little bit less, bouncing between 3 and 4. Now, there are times where Mass Effect Andromeda will use more than 4 cores, especially in certain moments during the single-player game. It will kick up as well. Many games in 2017 are starting to be like this. They run fine on 4 cores, they run better on 6. This is why I think that Intel is finally coming forward with its 6-core 12-thread i7 chip for the 8th gen Coffee Lake. Is the days of 4-core being enough for high-end enthusiasts really are coming to an end. So that's very nice to see. It's going to cost more than Ryzen 5 1600, but for enthusiasts who want the best performance, who want great single-core performance, overclockability, 5+ gigahertz in terms of overclockability, I think that the i7 8700K is really where it's going to be at. For people who are okay with 100 or less frames per second, for people who are on 60 Hz monitors, the Ryzen 5 1600 is still going to be the better value. There will be people for both, and I think that's a great thing. As a side note, while I let this play so you can watch it for a little bit, I have not finished the single-player story. I played Mass Effect 1, 2, and 3 multiple times. In fact, Mass Effect 2, I have at least 5 full playthroughs. Mass Effect 3, I think I ended up doing 3 times, and Mass Effect 1 I played through twice. This game I haven't finished. I got to the desert planet hunting down the Krogan and got bored out of my mind. I just couldn't scan another one of those stupid platforms. The story is kind of meh. If you're not that into Mass Effect, you're not missing much by skipping this one. Play the first 3, they are much better games. This is basically colonizing and exploring in space. It's drive around in your vehicle, which they did very well, by the way. The Mako in the first Mass Effect was awful. The Nomad here, exploring the terrain, is much, much better done. I really wish they would redo Mass Effect 1 with the Nomad vehicle and the mechanics. If they redid the planets in Mass Effect 1 the way the planets are done here, but with the gameplay of Mass Effect 1, I would absolutely go back and play that game again. I just haven't played through it a third time simply because driving around in that stupid Mako, fighting with the terrain, and dealing with some of the more primitive mechanics in that game, which was designed for a different era. It is in fact 10 plus years old at this point. Really is a painful experience. This is a better game technically. It's just boring. You're basically colonizing in space, and of course you are the Pathfinder and you're going around and you're creating settlements but you're also an ace expert combat person, which the two have nothing to do with each other. You're not going to be sending your combat person out doing settlements and exploration. The whole thing is just kind of very far-fetched. And then you arrive and everything's a mess. I don't want to spoil it for you, but basically you don't know where anybody is. It's not like you expected, yet somehow you had all the time in the world for the ship's computers to watch what's going on, and you lost track of everybody, but you have advanced technology, and frankly, the entire story doesn't make any sense. And I'm sorry, but the Ryder character is not compelling in the way that Commander Shepard was. Commander Shepard was always sort of a no-nonsense, take-no-prisoners, N7 elite BA character. Ryder is a Pathfinder for colonists. It doesn't quite hold up. I'm going to cut this run short because I think the point's been made. It runs just fine. Let's take a look at Battlefield 1, a game that is far more popular than Mass Effect Andromeda and still has an active multiplayer game base. Now, I am playing in multiplayer. Maps affect performance. There's a lot of difference between the different maps here. If you're on the desert map versus this map, you are going to see a different frame rate. But I'm not here comparing multiple machines worried about the map. I'm just giving you an idea of what to expect. And since we're not on the desert map, the fact that we're getting over 100 frames a second is a really good sign. VRAM usage, just under 3 gigabytes. There's no circumstance in which Battlefield 1 needs more than 3 gigs at 1080p. 1440p, yes. And actually, the GTX 1060 6GB card will play Battlefield 1 at high detail at 1440p well enough. It's not going to be at 100 frames per second, but it will play it, and it's one of the few exceptions where that makes sense. But if you are a competitive multiplayer and you want to actually be really good here, then you want 100 plus frames a second in order to get quick responsiveness, in which case you're either playing at lower detail settings or you should have a GTX 1070 or 1080. Take a look at line 3, the CPU. We are using 6 cores at the moment. There's times it's going to jump to over 8 threads. A Ryzen 7 1700 is not wasted on Battlefield 1. You're not seeing it at this particular point in this map, but this game, which launched back in 2016, is one of the first mainstream AAA titles that clearly and obviously used more than just 4 threads. So it really kickstarted the whole era of needing more than just 4 threads. If you watched my original Skylake overview from March of 2016, I made the comment at the time that you didn't need more than 4 threads. You didn't need more than an i5 in order to play games. I said i7s were great for productivity and for business use and for multitasking, but if all you cared about was playing games, save your money and buy an i5. Now that was true at the time. Little did I know that it would change this quickly, but hey, advice is true at the time it's given, but it changes over time. Hey, I got somebody, yay me, I'm usually not that good. So we have very quickly entered the period where multiple games, not just this, but the single-player Mass Effect Andromeda, Ghost Recon Wildlands, The Division in the PvP Dark Zone sections, are absolutely using more than 4 threads. Now you can buy an i7 or a Ryzen 5 1400 or 1500X to get a 4-core 8-thread chip. Please note that threads are not cores. When you hit 50% on a hyper-threaded or SMT processor, the actual processing power of the chip is at maximum. Anything over 50% and now you're into the virtual cores. Yes, the game or program can schedule more things to do, but it can't do them. It can only do 6 things at a time in the case of the 1600. So anytime you're over 50%, Windows, the game, etc. has scheduled more than 6 things, and then the processor, see there we're at 74%, 64%. Basically, the game and Windows are scheduling more than 6 things at once. The processor is saying, sure, fine, send me 12 things to do. I'll decide what order to do them in, 6 things at a time. So that's the difference between threads and cores. If you really want to play AAA games to their best performance and you want the most life out of a CPU, currently the price difference between a Ryzen 5 1600 and a Ryzen 7 1700 is $80. If you're spending over $1,000 on a computer in 2017 and AAA gaming is on your list of things to do, if you have the $80, I think a Ryzen 7 1700 is a better long-term investment. No, you don't need it in 2017. No, I don't think you'll need it in 2018. Of course, it'll be nice to have. It will smooth things out and you'll grow into it, but you don't need it per se. But I would like to point out that if you want to keep your CPU for 5 years instead of 3, a Ryzen 7 1700 is a better 5-year purchase than the Ryzen 5 1600. For 3 years, for just gaming, a Ryzen 5 1600 is probably plenty. But if you have the $80 to spare and you want your computer to last longer, buy the Ryzen 7 1700. I don't want to say future-proof, but future-proof your computer for an extra year or two beyond what the 1600 will give you. As a general rule, the more you spend, the longer your computer lasts before you have to spend more money. Now enough of Battlefield 1, this is running at 100 frames a second. Let's go take a look at Grand Theft Auto 5. Now Grand Theft Auto 5 is nearing 2 years old on the PC, older on the game consoles, but it was re-optimized and cleaned up and improved for the PC, so for this version of the game, it's approaching 2 years old. It is, however, still demanding. It is gorgeous. Pardon me while I toss grenades into traffic. None of them will mind, I'm sure. Ooh, that's gotta hurt. Property values in this area keep dwindling as for some reason a crazed lunatic in a white performance car keeps throwing grenades into traffic. Film at 11. For those of you who don't watch all of my game performance videos, I usually start GTA 5 here doing the same thing, hence the joke. In any case, I'm going to drive around and create some ruckus for a bit, steal some cars, steal a big rig, and see how much property destruction I can create. Don't think of me as a random bad guy. Think of me as an intelligent Lex Luthor trying to drive down property values so I can scoop it up at a bargain, end the crime wave, and make a fortune on the increase in real estate prices. Thinking. Coming back to the performance numbers, we're using less than 2.5 gigabytes of VRAM. This is one of the most commented on titles whenever I talk about VRAM usage. Yes, I'm aware that when you set the detail to very high, the game says it wants 3.3 gigabytes of VRAM. And in fact, it will use 3.3 to 3.5 gigabytes of VRAM when you have a 6 gigabyte card. However, I have tested this on very high detail on the 3 gigabyte card. The actual real performance difference between 3 and 6 gigabytes is less than you'd think. Even though it goes over the 3 gigabytes actually allowed and eats into main system RAM a little bit, it does not actually deter the performance very much. The performance difference is not as great as you'd think. But when we're at high detail to get high frame rates here, you'll notice we're not even using 3 gigabytes of VRAM. As I said, every game tested here, ooh, that was close, that would have hurt. I'm gonna roll it over anyway. Now, at the high detail that every game here was tested, you can see that so far the only game that has used all 3 gigabytes was PlayerUnknown Battlegrounds. While it was using all the VRAM, its performance was quite good actually. In terms of CPU usage, we're mostly just using 4 cores here, although it does jump up into the 6 range, which is why I recommend a Ryzen 5 1600 for AAA gaming. Even this 2-year-old game is going above 4 threads in many situations, and we're just driving around, not even doing anything serious. Same thing with the main system RAM, especially in open world games. Grand Theft Auto 5, Mass Effect Andromeda, Ghost Recon Wildlands, games that have large open maps and a lot of things going on, they stream a lot of the information into RAM, and the more RAM you have, the smoother it is as you travel around. Now, of course, if you have the game loaded on a solid-state drive, and as you drive around the city, the dynamic loading of the detail of the environment won't be too bad. But if you're playing off of a hard drive, there will be far more stutters as the frame rate drops when you're driving around and the game has to dynamically load new areas into the map. Now, playing other games that are not quite as open world, when I was, for example, playing in the underground of The Division, once the map is loaded, it's pretty much there, so the main system RAM usage is lower. In the above ground areas of The Division, the main system RAM usage is often higher because it has a larger open world map to load, and you can have far more freedom of movement. There's more to be loaded at once, and you can stream the world. If you run across the world, the world has to dynamically generate as you move around. Now, there is something I haven't mentioned yet in this game that is very, very important. Graphics card usage. Every single game that I've shown you up to this point, the graphics card was basically pegged at 99%. Notice it's not here. We are not limited by our graphics card. Now, a GTX 1050 Ti would not be running quite this fast, but you might be surprised, it would be awfully close. The fact of the matter is, Grand Theft Auto 5 is far more of a CPU-limited game than I think a lot of people give it credit for. Our graphics card is quite literally sitting around waiting for the CPU to give it something to do. The frame rate would not rise here with a faster graphics card. A GTX 1080 would be no faster than this. Now, it's true that we are in fact running at high detail and not very high. The graphics card usage would go up a bit if we were at very high, but the frame rate would not drop much, if anything. And the reason for that is because we are CPU limited. Grand Theft Auto 5 likes a lot of performance, but we are at 100 frames a second. If you have watched my previous videos, I have said time and time again, Ryzen is all that you need if you want to play games up to about 100 frames per second. If you want 144 to 165 frames a second, if you have a 144 to 165 hertz monitor and you want to play at those frame rates, an i7 7700K overclocked to 5 gigahertz is what you need. High frame rates need a high-end CPU. High resolutions and high details need a high-end graphics card, and high-end details, high-end frame rates, high-end resolutions basically need all of the computer. Essentially, the question becomes, how much money do you have? You'll need all of it. Because if you want to play, say, at 1440p resolution, at very high detail, at 144 frames per second, you need everything you can throw at it, and you're going to be upgrading your computer every year to maintain that as new releases come out. It is worth noting that if you want to play on the bleeding edge, upgrades frequently are going to be required. While the i7 8700K is supposed to be coming out later this year, if you want to play at 144 frames per second in August of 2017, the 7700K is where you should be at. Of course, if you can wait for the 8700K to come out, by all means do it. It's supposed to have an out-of-the-box turbo speed of up to 4.7 gigahertz. Hopefully, we get at least 5 gigahertz. If we can get 5 gigahertz on all 6 cores, that will be awesome. And it will be noticeably faster in frame rates in games like Grand Theft Auto 5 compared to the Ryzen CPU. It'll make less difference in other games. Some games are more graphics card limited than others. For example, in Ghost Recon with a GTX 1060, you're not likely to see much, if any, frame rate difference between a Ryzen 5 1600 and an i7 8700K. But in GTA 5, you will. Now, if you get a faster graphics card, for example, a GTX 1080 or 1080 Ti, then you would see a bigger difference in frame rates between a Ryzen 5 1600 and an i7 8700K. That's where the faster CPU is worthwhile. But actually, that makes sense. I would never recommend a $220 graphics card for a $350 CPU if gaming is your goal. Those are completely mismatched. In general, your graphics card should never be less expensive than your CPU if gaming is a primary concern of yours. And in general, I recommend that you spend twice as much money on your graphics card as you spend on your CPU. Now, having just said that, we are running a computer here where the CPU and the graphics card are almost exactly the same price. You can do it, and as you're seeing from these game videos, it works very well at 1080p. At 1440p, you'd want a 1070 or 1080. Now, if you can find a 1070 for about $370, $380, which is the normal price, it's a good deal, but not at the current prices in August 2018 they're going for, which is why I said just skip it, step up to the 1080, which is a little more than I would normally suggest, but it's a great card with great performance and will last you for years to come. So 1440p, Ryzen 5 1600, 60 to 100 frames per second, great combination. Or this card and a Ryzen 5 1600 for 1080p, great combo. Ouch, that hurt. All right, moving on to Overwatch. Now, Overwatch will play just fine on a $100 GTX 1052 gigabyte card. You absolutely don't need either this CPU or this video card to play this game. Now, you want high frame rates? Take a look. Overwatch is an example of a game that does use the threads. We are, in fact, using all 6 cores at the moment, and we are getting 150 frames a second for it. The graphics card helps. You're not going to get 150 frames a second on a $100 1050, but you'll get 60 to 100 frames a second if you have a good enough CPU. But if you do want to play esports and casual games, and this is the only one I'm showing simply to make the point, it's popular. We are playing at high detail. All the settings, including textures, are turned to high, and you can see that we're only using about 1.3 gigabytes of VRAM, but we are using the Ryzen 5 CPU to its fullest extent, at least in terms of true cores. We're almost at 50%, which means 6 cores are being used, and I died. I am not testing at ultra or epic detail in this game, even though it would run just fine for 2 reasons. Number one, I'm maintaining the theme of high detail across the board. All the games that you're seeing today are high detail, same settings across the board. But most importantly, many competitive Overwatch players absolutely will turn down the detail because they're much more interested in high frame rates when you're playing an online multiplayer game like this than they are in having some shiny or pretty graphics. What this shows you here is a Ryzen 5 1600 and a GTX 1060 will absolutely play this game consistently at 150 frames per second. Now, if you watched part 2 of this video series, you saw an $800 build instead of a $1,200 build that still keeps the GTX 1060, still keeps the Ryzen 5 1600. It makes other compromises, 8 gigs of RAM, cheaper case, cheaper power supply, some other changes to the storage, but for $800, you still get a 6-core 12-thread processor, you still get the 1063 gig, and so playing games like Overwatch, Dota 2, Counter-Strike Global Offensive, League of Legends, World of Tanks will all run at these kind of frame rates or better on this system, whether or not you build the $1,200 version or the $800 version. That is a lot going on. No, I'm not going to survive this. Oh, I died. But if you watch the real-time performance, which I think is so much more useful than charts, which is why I include it, you can see where the performance dips are. When you look at the chart in just a minute, you're going to see the average, and then you'll see the 1% and the 0.1%. In Overwatch, there is a huge gap between the average frame rate and then the minimum 1% and 0.1% numbers, and this real-time performance lets you see that. Look right now, we're at 160, 170 frames a second, but nothing was happening. This is why charts can be so deceptive, and that could have been a good shot, but I totally screwed that up. When we get into heavy combat, in fact, just a minute ago you saw that we were down into the 120 frame per second range. Do you care? That's totally up to you. It is entirely personal as to whether or not you're looking for 60 to 100 frames a second, or are you looking for 144 to 166 frames a second. There's even 240 frame per second monitors out at the moment, although you're probably going to want more computer for those. If you really want to play games on one of the new 1080p 240 hertz monitors and you're a serious competitive player, you'd want the GTX 1080. You probably would want an i7 7700K overclocked to 5 gigahertz for the extra performance, and you'd probably turn the detail down. Low detail for that kind of environment makes sense, and you are going to get over 200 frames a second. In fact, Overwatch will run it up to 300 frames per second with the appropriate hardware. But in my opinion, that's a very limited market. The number of people who really want to run at 240 frames per second is a very, very tiny percentage of the market. Looking at online charts of what kind of monitors are selling and looking at the Steam hardware survey, I think most people are actually on 60 hertz monitors, with a smaller percentage at 100 hertz monitors. Very few people, for all the talk of 144 hertz monitors that you see on YouTube, I don't think even more than 5% of gamers are really playing on 144 hertz monitors. It definitely is a market, but I believe it's a niche market, with the vast majority of gamers actually playing either at 60 hertz or 100 hertz or somewhere in between. Now, of course, if you are in that market, then you, of course, look at it and go, well, I'm 100% of the market because that's what I play at. But I make videos for everybody, not just people who have lots of money. It's an interesting point that 144 hertz monitors, especially at 1080p, are no longer actually that expensive. The computer to drive them can be, but the actual monitors aren't that expensive. Now, this isn't that hard to do, but if you want to play Ghost Recon Wildlands at 144 frames per second, the monitor might only cost you $200. The computer to play it can easily cost you 5 to 10 times that amount. Let's take a look at the results of these 4 games. Mass Effect Andromeda, 77 frames per second average. Battlefield 1, 96 frames per second average. Grand Theft Auto 5, 98, and Overwatch was 153. Looking at the 1% playability minimums, we see 50, 68, 70, and 111 frames per second between the 4 games, with the blue bars, the 0.1%, a bit below that. How much you care about the drops below 60 frames per second depends entirely upon your personal taste in gaming. As I said before, you need more graphics card or lower detail settings if you want those minimums to be at or closer to 60 frames a second. But notice that even in Battlefield 1, high detail 1080p, our 1% minimum is over 60 frames per second. Our 0.1% minimum in GTA 5 was 60 frames a second. Furthermore, that game is the exception. Now, if you didn't watch the gameplay, let me repeat it here. Grand Theft Auto 5 was limited by our CPU, not our graphics card. A 1080 wouldn't run any faster at high detail at 1080p. That game is CPU bound. The other games were still largely GPU bound. Sometimes it was CPU, but most of the time, more performance will require more graphics card. But Grand Theft Auto 5 is a bit of an exception. It's a very CPU demanding game, and if you want more frame rate than this, then you need a faster processor. Overclock this to 4 gigahertz or one of the i7s from Intel. Overclock to 5 gigahertz if that 144 frames per second is what's important to you. 13 games tested. Every single game averaged at least 60 frames per second on the $220 GTX 1060 3GB card. For gaming in 2017 and even into 2018, I think that's all you need for 1080p gaming at high detail. If you want to extend that to 3 years, GTX 1080 or the RX Vega 64 if you can find one for about $500. A good middle ground option, if this is too much but you want more than that, would be the GTX 1070. But as I said before, I wouldn't pay any more than about $350 for one. If you're watching this in the future, that's about where I'd want to be spending. The other option, launching in about a week from when I publish this video, is RX Vega 56, the baby brother to the 64, which competes with the 1080. Now it is supposed to be launching for $399. At that price, I would consider one. The challenge is, are you going to be able to buy one when they launch on August 28? If you can find one for $399, it could be on your short list. Take a look at the benchmarks and see whether or not that's something you're interested in, but I wouldn't pay any more than that. So those are your alternatives. Performance on this card, 3 years on this, or buy this if you want 1440p gaming for the next 18 to 24 months. This has been the game performance review of the $1,200 Ryzen 5 1600 computer build video series. Like this video if you like it, share it with your friends if you loved it. Remember to subscribe to my channel with the big huge red button directly below. Questions and comments in the comment section. And as always, please check out the links in the video description. Besides the timestamps down there, besides the link to the full playlist of this video series, check out my links to Amazon and Newegg for all the parts included in this build. Use those while shopping. It helps me out and I would greatly appreciate it. Be sure to follow me on Twitter and Twitch as well. Links at the very bottom of the video description for notifications of other deals and to be notified when I'm streaming. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you in the next video.